Now let's look at society and the societal level of harm that same-sex behavior causes. So one example, very shocking, is what's called drag queen story hour. And if you haven't heard of this, then maybe you can look online, just Google Drag Queen Story Hour. They even have an official website. They're very well funded. And this is the practice of taking drag queens and booking them at public libraries and even elementary schools, so that a man dressed as a woman, oftentimes a homosexual man, will go and read about homosexuality and dressing as the opposite sex to 4 and 5-year-olds, kindergartners. So this is something that has become common in the past 2 years, and it's even gotten into the news for bad reasons. I mean, if you can just imagine how bad this already is. But it's even worse in the sense that it's been discovered that some of these drag queens going to the public library, going to the elementary school, are sex offenders, convicted sex offenders. And this is what parents who are taking their children to the library to participate in Drag Queen Story Hour, I don't know what they're thinking. Maybe they think that this is a great example of tolerance and acceptance and so on and so forth. All of this nonsense, and you're exposing your child to, in some cases, actual convicted sex offenders. And you'll have videos online of what happens at these drag queen story hours. You have these men who are taking the kind of dancing and show that they give at the strip club, at the nightclub, and they're doing it in front of kids. And this, you can see like the parents in the background clapping their hands. Oh, look at this. And it's just a travesty. This is child abuse. But this has become normalized, and you have public money, taxpayer dollars, going to fund these kinds of story hours to expose the next generation to this kind of homosexual behavior. And I mentioned some of the homosexual critiques of the gay community in the previous sections. And the way that some describe is that the gay male sexual community is the equivalent of urban communities where hard drug dealers and their values are aggressively and relentlessly normalized. So you have this attitude of we need to push our values, we need to spread our values far and wide, which is interesting. Like, why would that necessarily be the attitude? If you have a certain kind of practice that you're engaged in, why does the rest of society have to accept it and feel that it's normal? And we saw this with overhauling Straight America and this kind of manifesto that we want to spread this as much as we can. Why? Why do they have this kind of attitude? And we also saw this when it came to Qawm Lut. They also were not satisfied. And when Lut alayhi salam specifically said that, you're engaging in al-fahisha is important. He's specifically saying using the definitive article, alif lam, al-fahisha. And some of the mufassirin said that this is because same-sex behavior is the pinnacle of lewdness. This is the pinnacle of fahisha. So this is the only place in the Quran where the definitive article alif lam is used, al-fahisha, as opposed to the indefinite fahishatun, for example. So this kind of behavior of wanting to push and push and push and get others to engage in the behavior itself, or at least accept that behavior, is found even in the Quran amongst Qawm Lut. They want to break in the door. They want to get to the guests of Lut alayhi salam. And when then they're rebuffed and they're not able to do so, their immediate reaction is to say that, well, expel Lut, expel these people, because these are people who want to keep pure. They want to keep themselves pure. And this is unacceptable. Purity is unacceptable. We have to, everyone has to be in the same boat. Everyone has to be in the same kind of deviance. Misery loves company. And so this is the kind of behavior and attitude that we find with Qawm Lut, mentioned in the Quran, and we also find it in the modern day community, exactly as is described in the Quran. And one part of this gay culture in the West is the idea of being a bug chaser. Bug chaser. This is a subcategory within the gay community. Bug chasers and gift givers. What does it mean to be a bug chaser? I alluded to in the previous modules where I said that these are individuals who want to be infected with HIV. They're chasing the bug. They're chasing STDs. Why? Because this is giving them a thrill. This is a kind of fetish for them, and they get sexually excited at the thought of being infected with HIV. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the amount of depravity to have a mindset like that where you want to willingly be infected with a life-threatening illness like HIV? But it's so common and so prevalent that they even have a term for it, the bug chasers. And the gift givers are those who have HIV or they have AIDS and they're willing to infect people. They're willing to spread that. And that's part of the overall gay community. This is something that, again, the mainstream of America and the West in general have no clue about these kinds of practices and these kinds of destructive behaviors, but this is a reality. This is what's happening, and it has to be sanitized and shielded from mainstream knowledge. And this whole practice, bug chasing, gift giving, also pausing referring to positive, giving someone HIV positive. So the same idea. They call this practice of getting the virus, getting HIV, as the F of death. I'm not going to say the profane word, but literally the F of death. And it's that exciting that has a term for it, that they are searching for, they're wanting for the F of death. And this is why we call it the culture of death. This is a culture of death that even some within the gay community in America have recognized and they've written about. And I don't recommend that you go and read gay magazines, but this is the kind of material, this is the kind of culture that you'll find described in those magazines. And it's what is called the Q type of homosexuality. As was mentioned in the overhauling of straight America, this is the type of homosexuality that needs to be hidden from the rest of the country. Otherwise, people will be repulsed by it, as they should. This is the real face of homosexuality, and they'll never accept it. They'll never accept this idea of quote-unquote gay rights and so forth. Another interesting just side note about the effect of same-sex behavior. And here, this is something, everything that I've mentioned to you so far has been based on scientific research, papers, actual testimony. This is a little bit more speculative, but it's something that we can reflect on. And what's interesting is San Francisco is the city within the West that is most known for being, to have gay culture, to have the highest population of homosexuals. And interestingly, it's also known as the poop capital of the world. The poop capital of the world. Why? Because they have what's called, what experts have termed a defecation crisis. With public defecation, it's extremely, it's a public health crisis in San Francisco. And so, one could say that maybe this is because of homelessness. There is a homeless population in San Francisco. But there are homeless in many other cities throughout the country, throughout the US and also Canada. So why San Francisco in particular? Well, we have to be very real. Again, if you think about the sexual act of liwat, we shouldn't actually call it a sexual act. It is an erotic act for the participants, but this is not what intercourse is. Intercourse is between a man and a woman, but this is the anal penetration, and the anus is a dirty place. This is the place of feces. And so if you are aroused by that, and if you have this kind of erotic attraction to want to do that to someone or receive that, then that means you have a certain kind of attitude towards feces and towards that part of the body. And that's just simple anatomical fact. And there's no reason to call that homophobic or call that bigoted. That's what the act is. That's what the act is. And so why do we have to sanitize our language? I'm trying to do the opposite of that in this course. We're trying to desanitize it. We're trying to give you the real face of it. So if you're comfortable with feces to such an extent, perhaps, Allahu A'lam, perhaps that makes you more comfortable with feces in general. And that could lead to a defecation crisis. That could lead to a filthy environment. That could lead to the kind of problems that somewhere like San Francisco experiences. And in the tafsir regarding Qawm Lut, the Mufassirin also mention that this was some of the kinds of what characterizes Qawm Lut is also very rude behavior with flatulence and regarding these kinds of bodily functions. That was part of the culture that they have created and part of the reason that they were kind of debased and vile people. Their prime crime, of course, was the same-sex behavior, but these are also characteristics that come with that kind of culture and with that kind of practice. So we're trying to fully flesh out what homosexual behavior and culture and behavior is all about, so that it's not an abstract idea separated from lived reality. No, we have to be very explicit. Now let's talk about pedophiles. Okay? This is quite eye-opening. What proportion of pedophiles are gay? What proportion of pedophiles have same-sex attraction? Over 30% of convicted pedophiles have a same-sex preference. So over 30%. But people with same-sex attraction who identify as gay only constitute about 3% of the entire population. So that's a big, big difference when you're only 3% of the population, but you are 30% of pedophiles. So they're way overrepresented in that category of people. In a paper published in 2000 by Blanchard and other co-authors, they noted that even up to 40% of those who say that they're attracted to children, who have a kind of sexual attraction to children, also admit that they are attracted to the same sex. So basically little boys. So you find that within all the proportion of all the pedophiles that exist, a large 30 to 40%, depending on the research paper that you read, are also same-sex attracted. So what is the proportion of gays who are pedophiles? So according to Kinsey's data, in his research, he found that 14% of gays at age 18 or older are also attracted to children. So 14% of the gay community would be considered having pedophilic desire. So it goes both ways. The proportion of pedophiles who are gay and the proportion of gays who are pedophiles. And it's a vast overrepresentation. And again, this is all peer-reviewed research data. Also, when it comes to pedophiles who have these same-sex desires, they also tend to be highly promiscuous. Right? We already talked about the promiscuity of gay men, but even amongst their pedophiles, the straight heterosexual pedophile has about average 19.8 victims, 19.8 child victims. But homosexual pedophiles have an average number of victims of over 150, over 150. So this is a big, vast difference. Another very interesting research finding that was published by a behavioral psychologist named Gordon Gallup. In 1994, he published research in the journal Ethology and Sociobiology. And he was trying to explain why is it that parents seem to have a kind of anti-gayness. Parents specifically have a kind of aversion to homosexuals, even if they claim that they're not homophobic and they claim not to be religious in any sense, there seems to be a kind of natural, innate hesitance and fear and suspicion and anxiety that parents have specifically about their children being in contact with homosexuals. So why is that? He wanted to study this. He wanted to give an evolutionary explanation, but first he wanted to quantify the actual phenomenon. And so he did 4 studies. He did 4 studies where he surveyed different people. And in one survey, he surveyed undergraduate students, both male and female, to describe their degree of comfort, their degree of discomfort interacting with homosexuals who held different jobs. So how do you feel about a gay professor? How do you feel about a gay construction worker, a gay doctor, a gay preschool teacher? So these different occupations, and the undergraduate students being surveyed would rate their level of discomfort. And what he found out was that the degree of discomfort was significantly correlated with the likelihood that persons in these categories would come into contact with children. So the gay doctor, or the gay teacher, or the gay kindergarten teacher, the gay daycare worker, there was much higher level of discomfort. And these are just undergraduate students who aren't parents themselves, but they still have this, even though the researcher, Gallup, is accounting for the fact that, okay, what if they're religious and other factors that might confound the data? He's taking into account of that, and it's still showing up this high correlation. Then in the second study, it was just about doctors, so just physicians in different kinds of fields. So first he just asked, without specifying the orientation, how do you feel, describe your level of discomfort for a brain surgeon, for a cardiologist, for a pediatrician, all these different professions within medicine, and they would rate, their degree of discomfort. And at that point, the doctor who had the most people had the most discomfort towards were brain surgeons, and basically medical professions that were the most invasive, like surgery and so forth. But when the researcher informed them of the orientation and said, okay, what about a gay brain surgeon? What about a gay pediatrician and so forth? Then the highest level of discomfort was for pediatricians, general practitioners, basically those doctors that had the most contact with children. And then the least discomfort that they had was with the gay brain surgeon, ironically. So this was also a very interesting study and result. Gallup did 2 other studies, one asking parents how they would feel if these were parents and other adults who did not have children. How would you feel if you had a 5-year-old child who was going to a friend's house of a parent who was gay? The friend's parent is gay, and a gay man or a lesbian woman. And so again, there's this testing of the hypothesis that parents have this level of discomfort and aversion, anxiety regarding their children being exposed to homosexuals. And the most anxiety was for a father who was imagining a 5-year-old son going to a house for a sleepover where there is also a gay father, a gay man. And then Gallup's final study was he wanted to take a broader sample. So he had done this kind of experiment for undergraduates, for young adults, but he wanted a broader sample of the population to test their level of discomfort for different fields and different professions to see if this was actually the case for the broader population, and he was able to replicate his result. And so it's a phenomenon that we find, that parents have this aversion. Now, when this research came out, there was counter-arguments. The counter-argument was that, well, these people are just xenophobic. These people are just bigots. Just like racism, they are discriminating against the gay professionals, the gay pediatrician, the gay teachers, and so forth. But Gallup responded to this. And he said that how can it be xenophobia? How can it be bigotry? Because that won't account for the fact that college students who have yet to become parents feel uncomfortable about the prospect of being in the presence of a homosexual teacher or a pediatrician or a doctor, general practitioner? Why would they be more uncomfortable being in the company of those people and having their children in the company of those people versus the gay construction worker or the gay pilot or the gay engineer? If it was just pure homophobia, if it was just pure xenophobia, why would that be the case? There must be some other underlying phenomenon. And so this was Gallup's response. So what does Gallup explain? How does he explain this kind of reaction that people seem to innately have? He thinks that it's evolutionary. He thinks that this is something where there seems to be a lot of data that proves that children who are exposed to homosexual behavior are more likely to become homosexuals. And so if you want to explain this from an evolutionary basis, then the genes for this kind of homophobia or aversion to having your children be exposed to homosexuals would proliferate. That would be adaptive because your children are not going to grow up to be participating in same-sex behavior, and then therefore they will be practicing opposite sex behavior, or they'll be more likely to practice that, and therefore those genes would spread, as opposed to genes of people who are fine with their children being in contact with homosexuals. And we already saw the prevalence of pedophilia within the gay community. So this is a kind of explanation that makes sense even if we don't accept the evolutionary aspect, and we don't accept the evolutionary aspect as Muslims, but we can still understand that parents can have an innate sense that I don't want my child to be in this kind of situation or in contact with these kinds of individuals. It seems to be innate, and that's what Gallup proved with his research. The final point is on bestiality, and this means sex with animals. And again, we see that within the gay community, those who identify as gay, they are more likely to have said that they have practiced sex with animals or are open to it than heterosexuals. And so among men, 20% of homosexual men said that they had either practiced it or open to it, whereas only 5% of heterosexual men said the same thing. And then among women, only 6% said that they, or among women, lesbians said that 6% would be open to it or had done it, and 0% of heterosexual women said that they had done it or were open to it. So again, these are differences, and it makes sense if you are, if you have that kind of desire and the shahawat, and you feel this sense of israf, that it's never enough, you constantly want to push boundaries, then it makes sense that you'd be more open to these kinds of extreme sexual behaviors. And that's what the secular research science has proven over and over and over again. This is the kind of society that is created when these kinds of practices are tolerated, when these kinds of rights and this lifestyle, quote unquote, is tolerated and accepted and now celebrated. It's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And now we're slowly starting to understand and see, well, why would Allah destroy a people for this kind of behavior? It's not something that's constrained to the bedroom. It's not something that's a private act behind closed doors. No, this affects the character of society, and we're going to talk more about that in the next module, inshallah.